The day was calm, and the sun was starting to dip low on the horizon, casting a soft glow over the sleek, modern mansion. The massive windows of the estate reflected the surrounding landscape, a pristine blend of manicured lawns and tranquil gardens. The black man, a self-made millionaire, sat by the glistening pool, his feet dipped into the cool water as he relaxed. He was dressed in a casual yet tasteful outfit, a simple black polo shirt and slacks, leaning back in the chaise lounge, a glass of red wine in his hand. His mind drifted to the journey that had brought him to this point. From humble beginnings, he had built his empire with hard work, intelligence, and a relentless drive to succeed. Now, as the FBI director, his life was a blend of high-stakes decisions and private luxury. But today, he sought nothing more than a moment of peace, a well-earned break from his demanding job. Unbeknownst to him, however, someone was about to shatter the tranquility of his evening. Karen, a middle-aged woman in a tattered floral dress, was wandering through the neighborhood. She had just moved into the area and wasn't familiar with the residents. As she walked along the street, her gaze fell upon the mansion before her, an imposing structure that screamed wealth and success. A sense of entitlement swelled in her chest. She had grown up in a different world, one where affluence had always seemed just out of reach. Her life had been a series of disappointments, but here, in this upscale neighborhood, she was determined to fit in. She walked closer, unaware of the man sitting quietly by the pool. At first, Karen simply thought the house was a place of interest, but as she ventured further, her mind began to stir with suspicion. The idea that the man, alone and enjoying his wine by the pool, was somehow out of place in this expensive area crossed her mind. But it wasn't until she took another step closer that her assumptions grew louder and more toxic. She could tell this wasn't a neighbor's backyard. The house was too grand, the man too relaxed. He was too calm, sitting there as if he belonged. It made her uneasy, stirring something inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. And so, without giving it a second thought, Karen, driven by an unshakable sense of superiority, made her move. She didn't know who this man was. She didn't care. Her eyes narrowed, and in her mind she had already written him off as a thief, an intruder in a mansion far too grand for someone of his kind. Unseen and unheard, she approached, ready to confront him. Karen stormed onto the property, her shoes crunching against the gravel path. As she neared the pool area, her eyes locked onto the man lounging under the fading sunlight. His calm demeanor only fueled her sense of indignation. She squared her shoulders, her jaw set with confidence, and she marched right up to him. "You!" she shouted, her voice high-pitched and trembling with authority. "What do you think you're doing here?" The man's eyes flicked toward her, calm and unbothered. He took a slow sip from his wine, savoring the taste. The intrusion was sudden, but he didn't immediately react. Instead, he let her words sink in, trying to gauge what had just happened. Karen wasn't finished. "You're robbing this house, aren't you? You have no business being here." Her voice was sharp now, dripping with contempt, and she stood tall in front of him, demanding an answer. "Get out before I call the cops." The man raised an eyebrow, still unruffled by her outburst. His presence was far too composed to be rattled by someone like her. He glanced up at her, taking in her disheveled appearance. "I think you've got the wrong idea," he said coolly, his voice steady and controlled, the contrast of his calmness against her aggression almost laughable. Karen, however, wasn't having it. Her mind raced with prejudices she had harbored for years. This man, sitting comfortably by the pool in his lavish backyard, had to be a criminal. There was no way a person like him could afford such a place unless he was up to no good. "I'm not blind," she snapped, her voice thick with accusation. "I know what I'm seeing. You don't belong here. This house is too big for someone like you." Her words were laced with venom, and she let them hang in the air as if they were undeniable truth. She couldn't fathom the reality that this man, in his laid-back manner, was exactly where he was supposed to be. To her, his presence in the mansion was an anomaly, something that didn't fit her narrow view of the world. With a disgusted sneer, she repeated, "Get out. Now." The man stood up slowly, facing her. His posture was nonchalant, his expression unchanged. He was no stranger to people like her, those who saw only the surface and judged accordingly. His wealth, his success, his status, all of it meant nothing to Karen. She wasn't interested in who he was or what he had accomplished. To her, he was just another person who didn't deserve the luxury of a peaceful life. But she was about to learn how wrong she was. "Call 911, he said flatly. "If you really think I'm stealing, go ahead. I'm sure they'll be happy to sort this out." His response was almost passive, but beneath the surface, he was already sizing up the situation. He knew how it would unfold, but his patience wasn't about to give way to anger. Instead, he let her walk down the path she had chosen, right into the trap of her own making. Karen, now convinced she was in the right, stormed off to make the call, utterly unaware of the consequences that awaited her. The black man didn't flinch. His calm was like a shield, an impenetrable barrier against the chaos unfolding before him. Karen's words cut through the air, thick with anger and assumptions, but he remained seated, his posture relaxed and unbothered. The wine in his glass swirled as he took another deliberate sip, his eyes never leaving her as she continued her tirade. It wasn't that he was unaware of the gravity of the situation. He knew exactly what was happening. A woman, driven by her own racial biases, had wandered into his space and started throwing baseless accusations. But the truth was, he had dealt with situations like this before. In his line of work as the FBI director, he had learned the power of staying composed in the face of adversity. Patience had always been his most useful tool, and in moments like these, it was his strongest ally. "Is that so?" he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of calm confidence. "If you think I'm stealing, then call the police." His words were simple, almost dismissive in their simplicity, but they carried weight. He wasn't going to feed into her hostility. Instead, he offered her a challenge, one that would either bring clarity or further expose the depth of her ignorance. He could tell that Karen didn't expect him to respond this way. She was expecting a confrontation, a shouting match, perhaps even a defensive posture. But he wasn't interested in playing into her expectations. He had already taken in the situation, and in his mind, the only thing that mattered now was the absurdity of it all. Her behavior was predictable, an all too familiar pattern of unwarranted aggression based on nothing more than the color of his skin. As she continued her loud, angry accusations, he simply watched, unfazed. His calmness made her more furious, each of her words growing louder and more irrational, as though the louder she shouted, the more she could convince herself she was in the right. But he had no intention of reacting. Instead, he continued to sip his wine, savoring the rich taste as if nothing in the world could disturb his peace. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about an unwarranted accusation. It was about the system of belief that allowed people like Karen to feel entitled to control and dictate the lives of others without question. He wasn't surprised, just disappointed. But he didn't show it. Instead, he offered her a solution. If she was convinced he was committing a crime, let the authorities sort it out. He had nothing to hide. "Go ahead. Call 911, he said, his tone casual but unwavering. "I'll be right here. Enjoying my evening." He sat back, letting his words hang in the air like an invitation. An invitation to call the police, an invitation for Karen to escalate things further, but most of all, an invitation to expose the emptiness of her accusations. Karen's face twisted in fury as the man's response cut through her like a cold, sharp wind. How dare he remain so calm, so unaffected by her outrage? In her mind, this was the final straw. He was either playing games with her, or worse, mocking her for standing up against what she believed was a crime in progress. Either way, she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled for her phone, her mind racing with thoughts of how best to frame the situation in her favor. She punched in the numbers for 911, each press of the button filled with a sense of righteous indignation. She wasn't just calling for help, she was calling for justice, or so she thought. The truth, however, was much different. "This is an emergency!" Karen shouted into the phone, her voice almost unhinged. "I'm at address, and there's a man here, he's trespassing. I don't know who he is, but he's stealing from this house. I've seen him sitting by the pool, and it's obvious he doesn't belong here. He's trying to rob this place." As she rattled off her accusations to the dispatcher, she was certain her words would be enough. She had painted the man as a criminal in her mind, and now, she expected the authorities to confirm her narrative. She imagined the police rushing to the scene, quickly apprehending the man and restoring order to the neighborhood. The justice she craved seemed so close, so tangible. What Karen didn't know, however, was that her assumptions were blind, her accusations baseless. The dispatcher on the other end of the line didn't immediately respond with the urgency she expected. Instead, the calm voice on the phone instructed her to remain where she was while officers were dispatched to the scene. "You're sure he's stealing?" the dispatcher asked, trying to gather the details of the situation. "Yes. I've been watching him for a while, and there's no way he belongs here," Karen insisted. Her voice cracked with frustration, but the dispatcher remained composed. "Okay, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Please stay calm." Karen didn't hear the warning in the dispatcher's words. She didn't register the fact that her accusations were being taken with a grain of salt. To her, she was in control, and once the authorities arrived, the situation would be resolved quickly, her version of events becoming the truth. Little did she know, her call to 911 would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel her own credibility and expose the depths of her own prejudices. The arrival of the officers marked the beginning of Karen's unraveling. As the police vehicles screeched to a halt in front of the mansion, their sirens abruptly silenced, Karen stood rigid with a look of disbelief. She had imagined this moment, envisioned the officers swooping in to remove the supposed thief from the premises, but what unfolded was far from what she had anticipated. The officers, two seasoned officers with years of experience, took one look at the scene and exchanged a knowing glance. The man, still seated by the pool, was clearly not the criminal Karen had painted him to be. They could see the calm demeanor he wore, his relaxed posture, and the complete lack of tension in his body language. Everything about the situation screamed that this wasn't a robbery, but rather an unfortunate encounter born from ignorance and bigotry. "Ma'am, you're the one trespassing here," one of the officers said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This is private property. You're causing a disturbance, and we need you to step aside." Karen, who had spent the last few minutes constructing an elaborate story in her mind, wasn't prepared to accept this. She was too entrenched in her delusions to back down now. The thought of being wrong, of being exposed as the one in the wrong, was unbearable to her fragile ego. She didn't care that the officers were seeing things clearly. She wasn't going to let them take control of the situation. "No! You don't understand," she shouted, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "He's lying! He's a criminal! He doesn't belong here!" Her frantic behavior was a far cry from the calm composure the officers expected. She refused to accept that her racial biases had led her to make false accusations. Instead, she began to flail in frustration, pointing her finger at the man as though her aggression could somehow change the reality she had misconstructed. When the officers attempted to approach her to make her leave the property, she snapped. In a burst of anger, she swung at one of the officers, her fist connecting with his shoulder. The officer, caught off guard by the assault, immediately reacted. His partner quickly moved in, pulling Karen's arms behind her back and securing her wrists. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer," the officer said, his tone now tinged with disbelief. Karen's eyes widened with shock, her earlier confidence faltering as the reality of her situation began to set in. But she wasn't done yet. Her rage had reached its peak, and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. She continued screaming, thrashing against the officers, as they guided her toward the squad car. She kicked, shouted racial slurs, and spat, a far cry from the woman who had once felt entitled to control the situation. The officers remained professional, unfazed by her tantrum, as they placed her into the vehicle. Her outbursts echoed in the quiet neighborhood, a stark contrast to the peaceful surroundings that had once been the man's sanctuary. Her misguided belief that she could control the narrative had backfired. Now, she was the one in handcuffs, her dignity and credibility shattered beyond repair. Karen's behavior did not go unpunished. The officers quickly transported her to the local precinct, where the full weight of her actions began to settle in. The processing was swift, but it was the charges that followed that would haunt her for the foreseeable future. Trespassing, assault on an officer, and making false accusations, each charge a reflection of the mess she had created for herself. Her attempt to have the man removed from his own property had not only failed but had led to a complete reversal of fortune. She had gone from being an accuser to being the one arrested, and now she would face the legal consequences of her actions. As Karen was checked into the prison, the reality of her situation finally sunk in. The walls of the holding cell were cold and uninviting, a stark contrast to the comfortable home she had so thoughtlessly entered. The officers processed her, her personal effects stripped away as she was assigned to a small cell. The false sense of superiority she once held had crumbled, leaving behind nothing but the harsh truth. As for the black man, he continued his evening uninterrupted. The officers had quickly confirmed his identity, recognizing him as the well-known FBI director. His life, built on years of hard work and dedication, would continue as usual. His peaceful night by the pool was only briefly interrupted, but he had already moved on from the bizarre encounter. Karen's arrest would soon be followed by a trial, where her actions would be scrutinized by both the law and the public. The charges against her were serious, and the fallout from her false accusations would be long-lasting. But beyond the legal consequences, Karen's greatest punishment was the damage done to her own reputation and character. Her racism and prejudice had led her to make a baseless accusation that not only humiliated her but also revealed the ugliness that lay beneath her surface. The man, on the other hand, remained unshaken. He had faced prejudice before, but he had learned to rise above it. His success in life, both as a self-made millionaire and as the FBI director, was a testament to his resilience. His evening, once again, was marked by peace and tranquility, a reminder that the true measure of a person is not in the actions of others, but in how one carries oneself in the face of adversity.